like just a matter of kind of organizing, kind of coordinating how we should do this. We had that meeting that Rodrigo had a chance to kind of take a look, right? A couple of weeks ago when Moscardi presented, like gave a general presentation of the book. And then I sent to Rodrigo this kind of very long summary I did of like some basic ideas I took from the book, just also in hope that if he took taking a look at it, he could already see some misunderstandings, kind of the general messiness of some of the questions we kind of extracted from the last meeting. I think some of those questions there were, Dennis tried to kind of write down some of the points that were raised. So I'm not really sure how we should go about this. Like, I think the idea was perhaps to introduce a bit from our side how we discussed it, and just to get an idea of how the debate could go, and then move on to discuss more specific questions. I met with Dennis this weekend because Dennis is giving the next presentation, right? Actually, Dennis booked the next 3 presentations in a row to do like a Lord of the Rings 3-part presentation on this very specific topic of memory evolutive systems. And we were talking about how to make this discussion more productive than just like comparing big philosophical references and that type of thing. Since there is so much common ground, it seems, between what Rodrigo presented in his book and things that we are interested in, we came up with this kind of image for what perhaps was a good way of approaching this. Something actually that when everyone was here in Rio a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Vinicius, who is here, and we were talking about, he was kind of a bit perplexed at the level of eclecticism that we were presenting when discussing like very niche mathematical ideas and talking about them as if, SoCal had never happened. And we came up with this metaphor, like the idea is to make like the richer analogies that we can. So imagine you have like 2 systems that you want to compare. For example, you're talking politics and you're trying to make some references to some scientific thing. You can make very poor analogies where you say one thing is like the other and that's it. But you can also try to find more points where there are correspondences. And the more correspondences there are, the richer the analogy is, right? In the case of different frameworks for discussing organization, I think a similar thing can also help to picture a useful dialogue, because perhaps the useful, like productive thing is when from within one framework, between 2 steps, you can see an intermediate step that in the analogous system, there might be a direct step, right? So for example, just to be very broad about this, a lot of the ways that you, Rodrigo, construct concepts and like kind of unfold these ideas in your book, they are very concerned with dynamic kind of gradient mixtures between forces and processes. And because we sometimes work with very structural kind of static descriptions of things, there are a bunch of things we just skip over, and we don't have an intermediate concept there where you are much more nuanced in describing things. So trying to find those moments and understanding them better might help us pose questions within our own vocabulary that we simply wouldn't pose if we just spare that comparison, right? And hopefully, but I'm not sure if that's really the focus of this, but hopefully the inverse is also possible. Personally, after reading the book more than once, now for writing my Lutheran synthesis, like summary of so many theses of it, I realized that there might be a sort of question that we're starting to get used to posing that I'm very interested to see how it sounds to you, this line of inquiry and this way of posing concepts. So, but that said, that just seemed to me like this is a more useful way of approaching things, especially because the things that I know Dennis is trying to present to us next week, they have so much kind of superposition with a more dynamic kind of cybernetic based approach to organization, which is slightly different from what we've been doing, that it seemed like having this conversation now is a really good kind of mediating also moment to that presentation later on. Might motivate what he's doing also. So focusing on that seemed very relevant. So I'm not sure exactly what you guys think, and Rodrigo, what you think. I mean, I sent you that summary. I think it might be a bit too boring to kind of go through it and use it as a skeleton. I'm not sure if it's too.
Read the summary of the book.
Yeah, if it's too dry, to navigate the conversation based on it.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be pretty dry. I mean, I obviously would be fascinated because I think it's a better summary of the book than I have managed thus far. But at the same time, it would probably be super dry. And I think, because when I read the last time I had a look at the questions, which was about 2 hours ago, I don't know if anything else was added since then, but I had, like, as I told you yesterday, my first reaction when I saw some of the questions was to think, I don't understand what they're talking about. It's about my book. What are they talking about? But even that, and like reading them now, I could understand almost all of them, I think. But at the same time, there were quite a few which I thought, this is an interesting point, but I don't get exactly what's at stake here. Mm-hmm. Like, I can see they're going somewhere with it, and I can kind of imagine where they might be going, but I can't tell exactly why. What's the theoretical motivation, or what's the practical problem that's motivating them here? So maybe just like, I don't know how many people chipped in with the questions, but maybe if people could like go through those questions and like pose the ones that they proposed and maybe give a little bit more context on them, and then we base the discussion on those questions, because there's some brilliant questions there that I would love to, that I'm not even sure I have an answer for, but I would love to try and work on with you guys.
I know Vitor wrote some of them, but he's not here yet. Some of them are mine, but some of them are also I'm not sure who presented them in the previous meeting. If anyone wants to perhaps start.
Yeah, I could start actually, even though it's not my question from the last meeting, is actually Rafael Saldana's question, but I liked this question a lot, so I wanted to pose it, which is in the book, there is, from our impression, it seemed like there was like a metaphor of kind of ecological systems and natural systems that kind of have this dynamic interplay between them that is very interesting, and also what we talk about a lot here. I think our concern was, how do we distinguish between like social dynamics and natural ones, because it seems like the issue of like a self-regulation has a different meaning, or could have a different meaning in a natural system than in a social one. And maybe it felt like maybe it's too convenient to just lift that metaphor out of the natural world and say like, okay, now we have these self-regulating social systems. Doesn't that maybe erase the role of political struggle or Yeah, I guess the question is, how apt of a metaphor do you think that is, and like, are there any shortcomings to that, to using that natural interpretation?
Should we just do them one by one? What do you think? I think it's maybe easier, right?
Yeah, I mean, can I just add something which perhaps gives a concrete example to that? Because Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong, but one example of what you're saying is, for example, the way we understood, I'm not even sure if it's a proper understanding of it. I mean, you mentioned that some of the parts of the summary didn't seem properly formulated. So perhaps this is one of the cases, but when you're talking about diffusion control, that you talk about clusters,
right,
and this sort of regulation by reciprocity of a way that bars this sort of the creation of inequality in certain societies and bars the formation of states, and you take that kind of an example of a self-regulated kind of a regulatory dynamics between more than one organization, right? And I think that's a good example of this, because on the one hand, when you translate it into a more ecological systems kind of approach, it looks like the term regulation applies. But when you're talking about the social logic, there is a kind of normative dimension to that control, where I think it's a good example where the two things might blur a bit, right? Is this something where, another way of put it is that when you're talking about things in terms of natural systems, every action can be treated as a constraint because the normative dimension disappears a bit, right? Let's say there is a regulation because this can only happen if it constrains the other thing in this way, and so on and so forth. But normativity implies that actions can't really be reduced to constraints. There's a bit less of an equivalence there. So it becomes a bit of a matter of it should be this way rather than it will have to be this way. If we act this way, this process follows, right? So that might be an example of where does this make sense to you, Dennis? Is this an example of what you were saying?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of the ambiguity between prescriptive and descriptive. That was a theme that kept coming up in our last meeting. Because norms seem to be prescriptive, right? But a naturalist account of dynamics would be kind of descriptive, and they're kind of intermixed here, right? Where's the line there?
Yeah. I mean, this is great because it helps me understand what Rafael Saldanha's rant was about. I think it was about this, and I was when I was watching the video of the discussion, I was like, but what is it that he's talking about? And if I understand it now, I think that there might be a misunderstanding there. I mean, first of all, to take Dennis's questions step by step. First of all, there's the issue of the metaphor. This is still an open question for me. To what extent? Well, I guess there are two open questions there. One is, to what extent is it really a metaphor to talk about ecologies? To what extent it's actually not a metaphor? Like we can identify a similar set of dynamics. So there's the same set of dynamics would apply to both things. And then I guess the other question connected to that is like, how far am I willing to go in stressing the second point? I certainly tend towards the second. I certainly tend towards saying this is not a metaphor, but one thing that I didn't have the time to do exhaustively in the book was to really develop this argument. So, you know, I had, for the purposes of actually finishing the book within the time that I had, I decided to leave this relatively open and pick it up again at some later point. The reason why I'm talking about ecology, on the other hand, is not exactly because I had decided that this wasn't a metaphor. I could describe both things in exactly the same ways. The reason why I used ecology was because I thought it worked enough in this context, or it didn't create any problems that I could see, insofar as I could see them. But the reason why I chose the word ultimately was it has become a native concept. It was a word that people were already using, and they were already using, you know, in places like, particularly in the UK, it has become quite popular among movement people to talk about movement ecologies, blah, blah. Maybe less so in the US, but also in the US. And this is a transformation that's happened in the last decade. It's one of the transformations that I'm responding to precisely, where I'm saying, you know, there is something interesting, you know, when I say in the second chapter, what's happened after the defeat of the 2011 cycle is different to what happened after the defeat of the anti-globalization cycle, because there is a different level of reflection now. That's one of the things that I'm referring to, is the fact that more people have more and more started using this way of describing movements and framing their own participation in movements, or the participation of the organizations or the groups, etc., that they're a part in. The equivalent to that word in my vocabulary, in the vocabulary that I had developed in my earlier book, Organization of the Organizationalist, was network system, because I was departing from network theory there. And I was employing this word, which some other people in Spain were using at the time as well. And this would be the equivalent in that book, what I'm calling ecology in this book. And, you know, I think I would like to think that I actually indirectly contributed to the fact that more people have started talking about movements in ecological ways through that book. Maybe not directly, but through the fact that Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams read the book and quoted it in Inventing the Future, and they quote precisely the passage in which I use the word ecology or ecological, and then they ran with that idea, and they helped make it a lot more popular. But yeah, so there is an open question here as to how much of this is a metaphor and how much isn't. One of the differences, the second point would be the starting point for the book is a theory of organization cannot be only, or a theory of political organization cannot be only a theory of deliberate organization, as theories of organization have been so far. Because deliberate organization is conditioned and constrained by dynamics which no one deliberates. So a theory of organization is a subset of a theory of self-organization, in the sense that, you know, if we understand that these constraints come from the natural world, these constraints come from, at the very least, from physics and and biology, if we don't want to go full Platonist and talk about mathematical constraints as well. But at the very least, they are constrained by physics and biology. So you must start with the natural world to arrive at the social world, which doesn't mean that you reduce the social world to the natural world, obviously. Once you change, every time you change level, other things changed, and the new level is constrained to some extent by the previous level, but also relatively autonomous in its own way. One essential difference between natural and social dynamics would be in the case of social dynamics, you're dealing with agents who have the capacity to model the whole that they are caught within. And you know, the whole point about using ecology as a framing is precisely to propose a way of modeling that whole to people. So, you know, it would be impossible to I don't think this necessarily makes an organization, a political organizational ecology, a metaphor, but it entails that there's a difference when you move from the natural to the social level. There is something else that you need to take into consideration, and therefore, even if the same set of constraints or the same set of mechanisms, etc., apply, there is something else that you must take into account. Now, precisely with the passage that seems to have irked Rafael so much, what I'm saying is precisely there is no self-regulation there. And, you know, to use class here should be a giveaway, because precisely what happens in class is societies against the state can't hold the state back forever. You know, there is a moment when the state emerges, and then there is no going back. What I'm saying precisely is there is a way in which what's the problem I'm dealing with there in a nutshell. The problem is we always tend to think, well, how do we exercise control? Well, we need to put some rules in place, which means control can only be exercised within some kind of organization. You need to set up an organization and then specify some rules through this organization where you can exercise control. The problem is there is no space in which to pose those rules within an ecology. Is there any form of control that can be exercised in an ecology? And what I'm saying there is, yes, there is a form of control that can be exercised if A, people are aware of it, and B, people are exercising it. So I'm not saying that the ecology is self-regulated, and I hope that I've made myself quite clear in that sense. I insist this is a system that only works by breaking down. I think there is a passage in which I say, well, you're probably very disappointed that I'm saying this is all there is to it. But yes, this is all there is to it. There is no fail-safe solution to this problem. There is a possibility of regulation if people are aware of it and people are using it. So there is a constraint that can be used if people understand this constraint. So we can describe a constraint that can be used if people normatively decide that this is a constraint that they would like to use. And I suggest that normatively it is a good thing, because you want to avoid a winner-takes-all situation. But if I understand the objection correctly, then I think there is a misunderstanding. I don't think I'm mixing up the two registers there.
Yeah, my impression actually is that I understand what you're saying. Also, I mean, when you say ecology is not a metaphor, it can also mean two things, right? It can mean it's not a metaphor in the sense that what we are describing has the structure of something we usually call an ecology, but also in the sense that we wouldn't like it to be a metaphor, because the more a system of organizations thinks of itself as an ecology, the better. So the less it becomes a metaphor prescriptively, also the better, right? So the more we see organizations sharing an environment, this environment itself is not self-organized because it depends on natural systems. I mean, prescriptively, it's also more interesting, right? So I feel like the book is constantly working. Your explanation, I was exactly playing on this ambivalence, right? It is naming enough of something descriptive that if you were to take it as prescriptive, you would probably build better organizations to start with, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically the what I say at the start, that this is a book on self-organization as seen from a first-person perspective. You could summarize it as being precisely that, like the first wave in the use of complexity theory in political system, in political theory, tended to say, look, the scientific discourse on self-organization says that these kinds of constraints exist, or that these mechanisms exist, and therefore these mechanisms are going to work. And even worse, therefore these mechanisms are going to work in our favor, which is an even farther out there leap. And what I'm saying is the fact that the scientific discourse on self-organization is correct to the best of our knowledge, this in and of itself doesn't guarantee anything, because it's not necessarily, you need to specify the conditions within which those processes or those mechanisms can take place. It's what I say in the first chapter about how when people bring, say, Prigogine into political theory, they completely overlook the discussion on critical size, the necessity of nucleation, etc., all these elements that get completely overlooked in translation. So it's not a given that those things will work in every situation. You need to specify the conditions in which they work, and sometimes they won't be enough. And sometimes, because there'll be a tendency, for example, there'll be a tendency towards concentration, which is just as strong. And then if you want to rein in that tendency towards concentration, then you need to create mechanisms to put into place that will counteract that tendency.
Can I ask something? Like, okay, yeah. It's good to see you again, Rodrigo. First of all, like I got very happy to have the chance to reflect. Lucas is participating, but yeah, I got very happy with the chance of talking about the book. I had a question that that I have been I think I have been trying to elaborate like all the times that I actually talk about the book, but it's mainly about because there are two things that have interested me in the book in particular. The first one is like the usage of political realism as a tradition that like is relevant for dehumanization. And the second one, it's a much smaller question, which is like the concept of the conjuncture, which is a concept that appears in like a few places, but it is usually very important for like thinking about the matter at hand. And I remember that we talked when we talked in the New Center interview, like you mentioned that you were actually reading Althusser's what's the name of the book? Machiavelli and Us. And it's also another book that has the concept of the conjuncture as something that is very central for thinking about that. And I think I'm not sure if you got to that part of the recording, but we were thinking of like perhaps some relationship between this concept of the conjuncture that appears in the book and the whole endeavor of conjunctural analysis as something that like helps you get a grasp of the current political situation that you're on, and also like as a sort of a genre in and of itself of writing about politics. And yeah, these are two things that I wanted you to comment a little bit about, and like how were they inside the development of the book and so
on. Yeah, I mean the Althusser book led me to Machiavelli, I think, and this led me to thinking Machiavelli in conjunction with Kleist. And so to think of this, instead of thinking, the usually people who read one or the other would tend to think as one being sort of the opposite of the other. And
yeah, it's not there at first glance, right?
Yeah, and precisely bringing the two together was what allowed me to see leadership as a system that's regulated, if not self-regulated, but it's regulated or regulatable to some extent, even if, like all things that that depend on regulation, it can also, it can also go off on its own, and it can break down entirely. It often does. And then the thing, I think we talked about it in that conversation for the New Center. The comparison that Althusser makes between the Prince and the Communist Manifesto, and how the Prince is a manifesto that's written in a void, in the absence of a subject, and he's kind of casting around, telling different noblemen, you could be the prince, and why not you? You could also be the prince. Why won't one of you be the prince, please? And I think this way of thinking about of connecting this is a connection that's relatively obvious in a manifesto, right? A manifesto is a text that contains a description of a situation, a prescription in the face of that situation, and tries to both name the tendencies and the collective forces that could go in that direction, but also through the very performance, through the very utterance, to create those forces and those tendencies. But that can be, and I think this is one of the lessons from Althusser that stuck with me, that can be generalized to political texts of any kind, like any political text ultimately has this ambiguous structure of describing things, but also like proposing something to people. Hence why the conjunctural analysis and the theory of political organization in the book are so intertwined. Like, you know, I have this idea that I am talking mostly to people who've been through the last decade. And, you know, I want to talk to them about, this is why I'm drawing from examples mostly from the last decade that would be familiar to people around the world, that would be familiar as stuff that they tried to do. And I'm identifying in this conjuncture the possibility for a reposing of the question of organization, because I really do think that something changed in the last half decade in the way that people went about these questions. So yeah, I hadn't necessarily thought of that as an Althusserian experience, but I think the way in which I tried to combine those two things, that it is a book that's very conscious of itself as a political intervention. I guess this would be the Althusserian lesson. It's like writing in a way that's very conscious of the political intervention that you're making. Who's going to be reading this? To what end? What can you tell them? How can you situate them in the world that you're describing, so on and so forth?
It's interesting because I think it connects with Gabriel's previous question also, like about the whether like if the appearance of terms as in ecology they appear actually as metaphors, because I think that in this gap that you mentioned between the conjunctural and the theoretical, let's say, or perhaps like the field of a theory of political organization per se, and the field of what is a conjunctural analysis actually about, I think that the terms like both ecology, platform, a lot of the terms that you use, they actually travel on the both ways. So in this sense, they appear as like metaphors, if we think about like metaphors as these things that travel through organizational fields, but they are not really like mere metaphors in a very strict sense. I think they are metaphors as these devices, like Bogdanovian devices of organization, in which and I think that it's what makes the book so interesting in a way, because like when you were talking about like platforms and like the issue of like when you were talking about like the trade-off between decentralization and centralization, like you could remember very actionable examples. Like if you looked at I don't know, Alexander Galloway's book about the internet and about like DNS versus TCP/IP, like it looks exactly like that same struggle. Like you can find that in an actual device, in an actual like technology that exists, and you can find that same issue both as a description of something, but also taken like that being taken as a prescription for political action. So I think it helps clarify Gabriel's question as well.
Yeah, I mean, to put the same discussion in another vocabulary, the Althusserian lesson would be that a political text is always hyperstitional. Right, it's always trying to create something through the act of naming tendencies and or describing a conjuncture.
Yeah, this is, can I just add something there, because we had a discussion, I think at the end of I'm putting Caron into the spot here, because Caron brought this thesis. I liked Rodrigo before it was cool, like since his earlier work and things like this, and we were discussing, I wasn't
before he sold out.
Yeah, before he sold out, and I have the impression that this is something we struggle with, and we're currently writing a text for the next Crisis and Critique edition, and I feel like we're dealing with this issue that I think the book deals very nicely with, because you need to, as you said very clearly now in concerning Moscardi's question, there is actually three axes you need to kind of balance together. Like there is the problem of ideas, and at the level of ideas, this descriptive versus prescriptive balance is very important. But politics is kind of ideas plus people. You need to choose the ideas that go with people. It doesn't matter if they're the right ideas. So I mean, I have a kind of a good sense of who you're writing to and where you picked up, like this is the closest term, an ideal version of the debate that is already embedded in a conversation, right? So it seems to me like this is very well knitted in the book of not really starting any concept from zero, right? Most things that you introduce, they have some already recognized basis that's already part of a political debate that is going on. So it's actually part of the difficulty kind of knitting these things together into something coherent, because sometimes they're coming from different traditions, right? So this is also something I'd like to hear you more about, because I mean, even though I think you can generalize from your direct kind of conceptual characters in your head who you were in dialogue with, I think you chose them well because you end up addressing a lot of people from different traditions. They feel concerned by the way you're writing, but I imagine that you had a clearer view of who you were talking to, or better address this tradition rather than that way of approaching it. I just wanted to hear you talk a bit more about that also.
I mean, then there is on the one hand, there is an attempt to address some debates that I could see. There was an attempt to address like some eternal problems that always come back when people are organizing, and especially if they're organizing within certain traditions. So one thing that, and it's very rewarding when you realize that you've managed to hit one of those, because you're talking about them if in a group discussion and you mention one of them and there's someone in the back of the room who goes, so questions. So when you see like that air of long suffering, that air of recognition that comes from the long suffering experience of having to deal with those problems again and again and again, and then not going away. Like, for example, why do most horizontal groups die before they're even born? And I think I offer an explanation of that, and I offer a way of how you can bypass that or a way of framing the same problems that makes some of those problems disappear, or maybe makes some of those problems appear as not having a solution. So you're just going to have to deal with that's an open problem. It's not going to be solved. And organizing is actually just dealing with that problem on a constant basis. But then there's also the issue of trying to address as broad a church as possible. So really making an effort to be drawing on debates that are happening in different traditions, or there are more common in one tradition than in another one, and then really trying, sometimes when I choose a word like vanguard, I want that noise, and I'm using that noise deliberately. And I guess you could use, you could make use the book itself to make a theory of that. It's the question of the tension of information at the end of the book. Sometimes I go for more noise. Sometimes I go for something that's more easily recognized. Sometimes I'm doing in relation to horizontalism, a lot of the argumentative strategy is the argumentative strategy that, again, Althusser recognizes in Spinoza. You want me to talk about God? Right. I'll start with God, and I'll give you God, but my God will do something completely different from what you usually expect. And it's the same thing with horizontalism. You want networks, you want self-organization, etc. I'll give you all of that, but I'll give you in such a way that shows like it doesn't actually do. It's not the panacea that that people sometimes believe that it is. So yeah, there were lots of different strategies in that sense. But always trying to, at the same time, like trying to inconvenience people enough without inconveniencing them too much. So trying to provoke, trying to move people so as to force them to shift perspective, but at the same time trying to not pick any unnecessary fights. And to be fair, I think like so far I haven't come across, maybe the people who really hated the book kept it to themselves. So far I'm yet to come across people who really, really hated it. So maybe it worked. I think you
sorry, have you spoken to Jody Dean about it at all?
No, I haven't. I would have loved to discuss it with her. She was in my list of people to send the book to. I assume she got a copy, but then I never heard from her.
Yeah, I'm quite curious what you think. I think you make a really, really good critique of her work.
Yeah, no, me too. I mean, I had two people in my head who I thought, one of whom I actually spoke to the last time I emailed him. I said, I wonder what you're going to make of this book. You either love it or hate it, or love it and hate it in equal parts. No, I said, you either hate it or love it and hate it in equal parts. I didn't think I was ever going to love it, which was David Graeber. And the other one was Jody Dean, who I thought, okay, she's either going to hate it or hate it and love it in equal parts. Yeah, certainly not just love it. Who's next? Michael has thrown in some other questions. There's still loads of questions.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything just so people have a chance to also add stuff, but Michael, do you want to ask the long comment you added? There's something about Spinoza being beautiful. You can just skip that and go.
No, that's that one you can ignore. But no, the first one is just because I heard you talking. I was thinking about this cybernetic dimension, and when you said about this organization dealing with the ecological constraints, it reminds me that concept of negentropy, just about that. So is it a problem for you, or is it okay? It makes sense. Think about that. And the other one is kind of related, because I think there is this thing to see the constraints is really, for me, it sounds really Spinozist, because That's it. We're not free, but it can be a little bit more free if we can see that we're not. So it just comments, it's not exactly questions.
I mean, in the second, in relation to the second, for sure. Although it's a slightly different. It's a slightly different thing in the case that we were discussing about when we were talking about diffuse control, because in that case it's less about the kind of self-understanding that the ethics proposes, self-understanding of constraints, or the understanding of the constraints that one is subjected to oneself, and more about understanding physical constraints or biological constraints and how to use them to your favor. Just because, so say there is a tendency for power to concentrate in a network, and there are mechanisms you can use to keep that in check. You need to identify those mechanisms and use them in the same way that there is a tendency for objects to fall, but you can prevent them from falling by interposing a plane between them and the center of the Earth. So it's more about how to use physical constraints in that case, and less about learning about one's arriving at freedom through learning about one's the constraints that bind oneself. Although I'm sure there's also that in the book. As for negentropy, yes. I mean, why would I have a problem with that? I mean, organization is negentropy. Yeah, organization is the local negation of entropy, which is why it's also subject to, like, one of the things, another one of the basically, I think if you look at the end of every chapter, there is a reminder at the end of pretty much every chapter saying, look, it might sound to you like you've heard this all before, that I'm describing this magical self-regulating system which is going to save us all. But this is actually not why I'm saying. This is, if there's something that's original in the book, is that I think I'm the first guy to be using this reference to self-organization and saying it's not going to save you. At most, you can learn how to use it to your favor. And at the end of chapter 6, I actually make this point very, very clearly in relation to entropy. Because organization is the local negation of entropy, I think the sentence is, if given enough time and not enough work, everything will unravel. Everything will always unravel. So if you're expecting a theory of political organization to give you the answer as to what is the organizational form that's immune to entropy, you're just barking up the wrong tree. Not only with me, because I'm not the person who's going to give you that, but also, you're barking up at a tree that doesn't even exist, basically.
Just one thing about Spinoza. What I'm trying to say is not about self-knowledge, if we can say that, but to know nature itself. I think this is the constraint. When you look at biology or physics, you can see the constraints. I think this is the Spinozist perspective that I'm trying to aproximar aqui, tipo. That's it. But great. All that.
I'm
No.
very unapologetically a Spinozist, so you don't have to apologize for calling me a Spinozist.
Yeah, it's because Gabriel that hates Spinoza. I don't know why. Because
don't say that.
yeah, you hate. You're a bad person.
Not true at all. Actually, this leads
I
me
had
to. Sorry, yeah,
sorry.
Aaron, sorry. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I was kind of puzzled by the complete absence of Hegel in the book. Actually, this is kind of related to this Spinoza issue because, for instance, when you discuss real oppositions, everything was leading to something like Hegel at that point. But you took a detour and went back to Kant and defended real oppositions. I think it's in chapter 2 or 3 or something. It's before the bulk of the model. So I had this issue, like why I feel that Hegel is voluntarily avoided here. Like it's not just, it never occurred to him that Hegel would give some kind of solution, but it feels like you don't want to go there.
I wouldn't say so. I think it's probably more a matter of I know other stuff better. Like, you probably can get at most arguments via most thinkers. So, to be honest, it didn't occur to me in that discussion that I
didn't feel like that for sure. But anyway, of course,
it didn't occur to me that I could use Hegel to talk about real oppositions, or to do what I was doing with real oppositions via Hegel. Now that you ask me, I can think, yeah, no, that would have also made sense, but it was just more natural for me to go via Kant and Simondon, etc.
Also, a further question that has to do with the negentropy question, like you're using also, I'm not sure how you map this one to the other because you just gave a definition of organization as negentropy. At the same time, you're using Shannon's definition of information as entropy information. I'm trying to parse that out in terms of mapping this difference between first order cybernetics and second order cybernetics, perhaps, because they feel like, I'm not sure if you're familiar, Cecile Malaspina develops this a lot, and she kind of puts forward the idea that there's a contradiction there. Like either you have to think of it in terms of negentropy, either in terms of information or entropy. But the weird thing is that the formalism is the same. So actually, it's how you understand the formalism that differs, and it gives kind of completely different conceptual understandings of this. So I'm wondering how you parse out the relationship between the definition you just gave of organization, like you're kind of upholding the inner kind of paradigm, right? At the same time, you're using Shannon Weaver information entropy.
But Wiener didn't have a problem with either the formalism or, he couldn't because the formalism is the same, nor with Shannon's definition of entropy, or with Shannon entropy. I think the question is they're just talking about two different things. You can, or that they're coming at it from opposite ends, as it were. So why it's not clear to me. I've been meaning to read Cecile Malaspina's book for a while, and I used to think this apparent contradiction used to trouble me a lot. but it doesn't anymore, to the point that I can't really even remember what it was that troubled.
Okay, it's not a problem. It's just, that's fine.
I need to go back. I haven't thought about these things for a long time, but my impression is
the thing is, like, they use different dyads. Like, for instance, it's entropy and organization in Wiener, and it's in channel, it's something like redundancy and information. And in relation to redundancy, you have to have more entropy in order to have something that is informational. Otherwise, it's just redundant. You see, it's just like it's ground. It's not figured. So it seems to entail. Of course, they have a kind of partial overlap, because there is the contrast. There's a contrast between, I don't know, complexity at stake, but at the same time, they seem to entail opposite things at the same time. Like the more organized is more entropic, and for the other one, the more organized is less entropic, something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I think you can solve this by shifting perspective from the receiver to the emitter. That's basically, so actually you could use, I think that's how I used to, it's funny, I haven't thought about these things in a long time, to the point that they're a bit alien to me now. But I think you could use, or I seem to remember using precisely Simondon's idea of tension of information to solve that. So you basically have the same thing seen from two opposite ends.
Yeah, I was trying to map this onto first order and second order. For instance, in first order cybernetics, you could have like an organization as negentropic, while for an observer observing a system, you'd have to have like a difference that makes him extract information. So in order for him to extract information, you have to have like this gradient out of what it's taken as redundant. Taken as redundant is not a trivial here. Like it's not is redundant. It's taken as redundant because, you know, there's this problem of phenomenological astigmatism. Like if you have too much information as well, like it ends up adding to nothing. So yeah, something like that.
Because I would say one thing is a measure, and it's not even a measure. I'm not even sure that Wiener would claim that you can quantify that, or I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. But in one case, entropy would be a measure in absolute terms. I mean, it's always local, the gain in organization. So the growth of negentropy is always local, but you go in a given locality, you go from a lower entropy state to a state that contains a higher entropy element. The other one is a measure from the point of view of an observer. So Shannon entropy would be from the point of view of an observer, whereas Wiener entropy would be an absolute, or, you know, it would be not from the point of view of, it would be not from the point of view of an observer who's reading that as information, but the point of view of someone observing a state, the different states that a system goes through over time, and observing that within that system, there is a gain in organization in some part of the system. So there is a local decrease of entropy in some part of the system. I think that's basically how I went about these things. God, it's been a while.
I think I have
Sorry about that.
No, it's a really good question. But also I think it connects with something, I think it's, since Michael said have a problem with Spinoza, I just wanted to mention something which I think has to do with what Caron was asking, but also with the impression that I have more generally. I think I've mentioned this before. I mean, Rodrigo, when you were here last time, we were talking about the Carioca School of Organization. I have the impression that especially the issue of scale and how, I mean, I think this is kind of built into people who take Bogdanov seriously, that you almost are obliged to, one way or another, by the weird relativity principle that is implied in his approach, to start considering scale as something very much embedded in the very grammar of how you build these things. But I find that one of the consequences of this is that suddenly you have specific phenomena that look Hegelian or Spinozian rather than frameworks that look Hegelian or Spinozian. So my impression is that this is a kind of this issue is kind of over. Like, that's kind of my feeling. For example, I can actually describe two situations, concrete situations, where I think it's one or the other. For example, I would defend that the book had to deal with real oppositions in more Kantian terms than Hegelian, because I feel like, and this is, many of our questions actually try to add something, which I would say sounds Hegelian, but it's just a particular type of phenomena. It's not a proposal of a different approach. And what I mean by this is, for example, when you ask about, when you're trying to describe a pragmatic dealing with, let's say an avoidance of an exaggerated abstraction of two forces that are kind of struggle together, you're abstracting too much if you think of them in terms of excluding of kind of forms that you need to choose between them, right? The Hegelian approach tends to, in an absolute terms in Hegel, but now in a kind of situated terms in terms of the phenomenon, to suggest that there might be a point of view which usually implies a different scale. So it has that kind of non-transitivity between the immediate and the sort of mediated point of view, where this struggle now looks like a unified thing. It just becomes a stability on a different order, right? That's just, let's say, Hegelianism becomes talking about scales when there is no transitivity between a lower scale and an upper scale. That's just a phenomenon. It's not a logical way of looking at everything. And Spinozism seems to me to become, if you try to deal with the thing as it emerges and just try to act on it. That's why, you know, it looks more causal on the side of the Spinozian approach, because how do you act on mixed forces? Well, the first thing you do is then treat them as mixed. Otherwise, you're just gonna crap the situation. But while Hegelianism looks like it's approached as forms and more kind of stable, excluding things, because it's always looking at this minimal transcendence, right? If you turn that into an absolute problem, if it's not, scales are not part of a world, but are how you look at worlds in general, you always will prefer some type of immanent transcendence, right? You always claim that this needs to happen. There is no transitivity between the terms and the mediation. And if you turn into an absolute, the Spinozian approach, you will say, no, I need to bring this down. I need to project it down to the mixture that's actually taking place. But I feel like you don't need to choose that anymore. Like, for some reason, I feel like when you introduce the scalar dimension into this analysis, there is some pragmatism over which grammar is more appropriate to each context. So this is something I wanted to hear talk about. I have the impression that this is quite relevant to these discussions. And then just to add, like you said that sometimes the questions we were asking, it wasn't clear what the stakes are, right? So I just wanted to give, since it has something to do with that debate, perhaps, and some of these questions, I feel like they constantly go back to this point of, what if there is no transitivity? Or what if what appears immediately as a decrease in capacity is correlated to an increase in capacity at a different scale, something like this, right? You experience this as a constraint. I can do less, but from a slightly different perspective, you're actually able to do more. I don't know, something like that, right? I feel like generally let's start with that. I'm already talking too much. I can add something afterwards.
Sure. I mean, I really liked those two questions in the list that you sent me. I thought they were great, and I thought it was a great way of reframing the form force opposition to put it in scalar terms. And I mean, this is kind of this came back in the course that I'm teaching now on transition. This came back because I was telling my students last week, a student asked me, but is so-and-so being dialectical here? And I was like, well, the problem is precisely when you're dealing with something like transition. I mean, in general, dialectics in and of itself doesn't guarantee anything. You know, something is not going to work or is not going to be good just because it's dialectical. But particularly when you come to something like transition, where it's almost as if you're watching a contradiction resolve itself in slow motion. And it can start resolving itself and go on resolving itself, and then maybe it will start regressing and it will stop resolving itself, and you just go back to the first term that you have. So, you know, you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, and you have the classless society as your final resolution, and then you start going along the way, but you start coming back. When you get to that, when you're looking at that scale where you're seeing a contradiction happen in slow motion, you need the logic of real opposition. So that would be an excellent example, a temporal, not spatial, example of this shift in scale from form to force. And yeah, I totally agree with that way of posing the problem. There would be one thing, though, that there would be maybe two things that I would add to that as maybe a sort of justification as to why I wrote it in such a way. One is that I would say there is, and this could very well just be the Spinozist talking, but I would say that there is the point of view of form, and there is the point of view for whom there is force and form. And I'm not saying that the point of view of form is Hegelian, but what I was arguing against is possibly a poor reading of Hegel or a poor reading of Marx, of Hegel via Marx, that leads people to, but not only even, I wouldn't say it's got, you know, in anarchism, for example, I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with Hegel. And then the second thing is that form there is doing it's performing a double work, because it's also what I'm saying, when I'm saying you have to focus on forces rather than forms, what I'm also saying is this is why it's pointless to look for an ideal organizational form, because you could find an organizational form that does X, Y, and Z, but if the people aren't, if the form is not being enacted by people, then the form doesn't do what it is supposed to do. So form in that case being, you know, the living out of, you know, okay, we set up all these rules that would make this organization capable of doing X, Y, and Z, but we're not enacting those rules. And actually, there's one of us who's taken over the organization and is just doing their own thing. So clearly, the form in and of itself is not a solution for anything, which is like one of the refrains that I keep coming back to in the book. Stop thinking about organizational forms and think about, to the point that I think I say too little in the book about organizational forms. There are a couple of moments where I say, look, there's obviously stuff that there's ways in which you can play with form that will minimize these problems within organizations. But, I just vaguely gesture at it because I think it's been done elsewhere. And, like when I discuss Joe Freeman, like I think all the stuff she proposes as organizational measures, they all sound good to me. They all sound worth trying. But again, you could nominally have an organization that pursues all those or that adheres to all those mechanisms, and those mechanisms not be enacted. In relation to the second question about thinking the opposition between potentia and potestas in scalar ways, and I have to say this was the part in what I read of the summary they made, this, like the way you framed the opposition between potentia and potestas was like the thing that I had the biggest problem with. And I don't think it's entirely your fault. I think I could have done a much better job of posing that opposition in the book. And I've been thinking more about it since I'm actually considering like writing an article kind of revisiting that distinction to try and both clarify how I'm using it, but also like avoid certain confusions, and maybe even reframe it in a way that I think is more useful than the way I frame it in the book. But I was wondering about this question on how what appears as a loss of freedom in one scale might entail a gain of freedom in another scale. I mean, for starters, I hope it's quite clear that I wouldn't deny that possibility in the least. In fact, the very idea of organization is that there is organization from the moment there are constraints on the actions of the people who are acting. When people voluntarily accept constraints, and those constraints which reduce the freedom of those individuals, they enhance the collective capacity to act. So always, in a sense, there is a loss of individual potentia in the name of the enhancement of a collective potentia. Now you can take this argument further and say, you can argue on those bases something like, look at the Soviet Union. It was pretty bad. You didn't have a lot of freedom. You had no freedom of speech. There was no political life outside the party, but it built a state that was strong enough to fight the Nazis. It defeated the Nazis. And, this is an argument that you see people make as a way of justifying one thing by means of the other. So there was a gain in collective potentia that allowed the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. It came at a cost of huge losses in terms of individual, and even not just individual, obviously, also collective freedom, because people couldn't organize themselves collectively in all sorts of different ways. Now, the whole problem with the whole reason why we need something that does the work of the opposition between potentia and potestas is to give us yardsticks that help us orient ourselves in those in choices like those. Because with the same argument that I'm making in favor of organization, you can justify repression in the name of, well, but we built the military capacity to defeat the Nazis. So you have exactly the same thing. The imposition of constraints on a lower scale, implying a gain in capacity to act at a higher scale. How do you choose between those? Where do you draw the line? Where do you say, no, this is too much? I mean, obviously there is, on the one hand, there is the problem of demonstrating that it would have been only if the Soviet Union had exactly the repressive system that it had, that it would be able to. So, you have to demonstrate the necessity between that the only way to build that level of collective capacity to act at the highest scale was to impose constraints to that degree. But there's precisely the problem that I'm trying to grasp with this opposition is precisely the problem of, at some point, maybe the trade-off is a trade-off that's no longer worth making. And one of the things that I regret not having made clear in the book is that I do understand that the opposition between potentia and potestas, or that evaluation of, okay, this is where the line is. The trade-off ceases to be interesting from this point onwards. This is something that is itself perspectival. Like you don't have a God's eye point of view as Hart and Negri pretend they have access to say, this is it, this is where potentia ends, and this is where potestas begins. But you need at least a distinction. You need to be capable precisely to say that, there will be some lower, maybe there will be some lower level constraints that are not worth the advantages that they could bring at a higher level. But maybe you had something else in mind with that question.
Yeah, Renzo can ask his question first. I'll go back to this afterwards.
Yeah, I was waiting a bit whether Victor would join, but I think this last point touches a bit on what I understand his point is about, and regarding the role of antagonism and the role of doesn't like acting ecologically sort of like assume some sort of like that everyone agrees that we should do that from the start. And so what about anti-ecological actors, right? So this kind of problem of you still have to draw some lines. So my question also goes a bit towards that, in the sense that that's a question I have also within STP, like this. I think it's the tension between the sort of like meta-political framework in which we try to sort of like make different orientations sort of intelligible to each other, but at the same time, in concrete political practice, you sort of like at some point draw a line and what you consider, like, even when you say, okay, so yeah, I guess the question is, to me, is also always like in a concrete situation, it makes sense to talk about like acting ecological, because that makes visible a certain many dynamics that otherwise would pass unseen, like many effects between organizations. Thinking ecologically sort of helps to make this sort of issues come to light. But it's more concrete to think about like already within organizations that you're more or less fine of to consider your friends, or more or less like at least in a sort of like boundary of what you consider the movement to lie on. And different sectors of the left obviously won't agree where that boundary lies, right? So once you try to sort of like, I was discussing this other day, to try to find like the common place where like everyone agrees, there's no guarantee there will be this intersection where all actors more or less agree what's the inside of the movement, for example. So, and then does this notion of ecology has something to talk about this line being drawn. So like one criteria, it could be like everyone who acts like anti-ecologically it's outside. So sort of like behaviors that lead to, but at the same time, it begs a bit the question, because what you consider something to be ecological again. So I think it postpones a bit. And I think that's where antagonism plays a bit of a role. I have the impression that in concrete practice, you have to sort of like draw your line within the people you more or less already relate, and of course try to be more like generous in what sort of actor you count as being part of your ecology. But it seems that all the tools that you develop in the book seems useful once you already have more or less a line, and sort of like what organizations you're willing to sort of like interact and sort of build up ecology with, right? So if you're in sort of autonomist sort of like field, you have a hard time to like create an ecology with, I don't know, this very statist oriented. So this sort of bridging, so are we aiming to do this sort of like what scale of ecology are we aiming for, right? So if you try to get like the most permissive notion of left, but again, at the same time, we're also like sort of discussing that today distinguishing left and right is not as easy. So we sometimes have to sort of like be closer to like where rightist forces are too. So then suddenly are you part of that ecology? So I think this line, this demarcation problem of politics seems to be a bit outside of what the metapolitical framework can do. I have the impression it's sort of, it comes a bit later, and it's useful to sort of like make visible a series of problems that maybe, I think, in the last century, they were treated as pre-political because for many reasons, like they weren't like problems of reproduction, of composition, of logistical, like etc. and so on. I think this framework really helps to sort of like take this issue seriously, but I feel that this demarcation problem is still like maybe it's what the political is founded on. Like there's no framework that sort of can solve that in the end of the day, maybe. So I'm not sure. Yeah, that's more or less my.
Can I add something just so you answer the two questions together, because they're connected? Actually connects to what Michael was saying here on the chat as well. Because
yeah, I'm gonna say that there is some connection here.
Yeah, I think it's connected, because I think this is how we exactly Renzo's question is how we connect to the stakes of some of the questions we posed to you in that document. Because I mean, I think time and time again in the conversation, it become clear, and I think it's a really kind of great merit of the book, which I don't think we have many examples of this, of theories of organization which provide grammars rather than direct kind of deliberative prescriptions, right? So it's more about the system of trade-offs. Like, do what you want, but it seems like this comes with that, right? So there is kind of grammar-like approach, which is something we also use when we're talking about our own kind of way of dealing with these things. We're not saying what to do, but it seems like one thing follows from the other, or these problems go with that, and so on. Where I see a bit of a difference, kind of a different of emphasis, is that this organizational grammar here is very much connected with a more dynamic kind of causal approach, where it seems like if you do this, this follows. Well, if you have the capacity to do this, this has some consequence, or this implies something like this. Whereas I think we emphasized for other reasons, and I think this returned in a couple of questions, this phenomenological thing, right? We sometimes use this idea of objective phenomenology. Recently, I discovered this is Nagel's concept. I thought it was like a cool French concept, but it's a boring analytic concept. But I think it has to do with this, which is exactly the question about Soviet Union, for example. And again, the question Renzo posed. We've been focusing a lot, like we've been kind of opting to always privilege something. I mean, the nerdy version is called organizational Trinitarianism, which is the idea that to think organizationally is always to consider three angles as being equivalent, which is questions of interaction. So what differences make a difference? No, sorry, what differences can make something different? Questions of intelligibility, which is what difference are relevant or make a difference for this system. And the third is questions of composition, which is how differences can make different differences, right? So how things get composed together. I have the impression that cybernetics tends to emphasize intelligibility and interaction. So as things interact, you also get a feeling. I mean, information is a very good concept to name that connection between interaction and intelligibility. And we've been trying to track the issue of composition in this kind of, that's why we use this category theoretical framework throughout this issue. And I think it clarifies what's at stake in these questions a bit. Because, for example, when we say, what is the criteria? What is the line we draw? Things like, there are two, this is where, let's say, the cognitive phenomenological comes in. If you're in, for example, if you're part of a kind of set of autonomist organizations, you might take your own survival or your own goals as the best criteria for assessing good and bad decisions. It seems that an ecological point of view implies the possibility that you might find a different criteria of assessment. So something else grows or decreases in accordance to your actions, rather than your own organization. For example, from the ecological point of view, an organization dismantling for the sake of something else might be a really good decision because you're taking the point of view that takes some other criteria as the criteria that is measuring good and bad actions. Whereas without this ecological point of view, it seems like we're stuck with, my organization has the proper form, it's leading the movement, it's the best that we have, therefore its survival is the same as the survival of the movement. I measure my actions by my own organizational standards. And it seems to me the ecological point of view implies we can detach these two things. Now, what I think interests us a lot, we've been trying to develop this, is a theory of not only situating observers or situating the measure of what's good or bad action, or from standpoint that is both situated but not necessarily my own organization, but we're trying to ask what's the correlation between how an observer is composed and what gets to count as information to that observer. So for example, value is a particular form of organization. It organizes the production and organizes how commodities circulate in such a way that only some variations make a difference for value, for commodities. Other differences don't make a difference. So depending on how things are composed, for example, in a commodity-like way, it becomes a measure, like for Hayek, like price becomes kind of a measure of what differences are relevant, right? So that kind of intuition of, well, depending on how we compose some social objects, some social structures, they are better sensors for some differences than others, right? So for example, if you have a very rich system of Soviets, right? Suddenly you have some measure of some particular type of capacity that you can look, well, if it's decreasing or it's increasing, well, it's against this criteria we're going to measure if a strong state is a good idea. So there is some type of phenomenology that goes along with, like, seems like a good supplement to the ecological point of view. That is also, let's say, the theory of how, depending on how things are composed, it looks like you get different sensors for kind of like looking at your own action, right? So for example, if you have but you need to do this concretely. So I have the impression that this is a bit the stakes of these questions about mediation, intransitivity, where I need to find a new sensor to serve as the kind of correlate of my decision making. That is not the direct survival of my organization or my own cognitive impression of what's going on. That allows me to kind of follow the complexity of ecological system. Because the more complex it is, the poorer the already existing kind of measures will be to accompany that complexity, right? So how can that also grow together? It seems like it's a compositional problem. You need to create more and more complex sensors. And that, for one side, that doesn't seem to be one of the central questions of cybernetics. It seems to start from the idea we have, even if it's a situated analysis of an observing system, we need to start from the existence of an observing system. We don't ask the question, how should this be physically, how should an eye be physically constituted so that it can serve as a point of view, that interacts with light? That's not exactly the type of question, it seems. That's the kind of question I think it's implied in Renzo's comment or in Michael's comment. The idea that, well, you might have to organize across strange boundaries, don't really add up to your own mapping. So you need a different sensor of, what needs to increase or decrease to be able to evaluate if those are good decisions or bad decisions. I feel like this is kind of more where we have been headed. I have another comment, but I'll add it for later. Just wanted to kind of add the more technical version of the questions there as well. Not sure if it clarifies the stakes actually, but
yeah. Well, yes and no. It clarifies where the stakes are. I'm not sure I understand the stakes that well, but okay. Well, there's a ton of issues there. I mean, first of all, for a very direct answer to the question, but what about antagonism? What about what about actual disagreements among groups? Or what about, what if other people are awful? There's an answer. The interview I did with Nick Dyer-Woodford for his website, I can fish it out. I forgot to fish it out while you were talking to. But if you Google my name and Nick Dyer-Woodford, you will find this, because he asked me this question, and I gave him a very direct answer in which I basically said, well, yes, this gives me the opportunity to say what this theory of approaching movements ecologically or approaching politics ecologically cannot do. One thing that it cannot do is make antagonisms go away. Of course, there are, not everyone is going to be everyone else's friend. And I have absolutely no disagreement with the idea that demarcation is central. I agree. I think within an ecology, there will be people who will trace the boundaries of the ecology, both trace the boundaries and map the ecology differently. I said earlier that ecology is the word or the concept in this book that does part of the work that Network System did in Organization of the Organizationless. The other there were three major concepts, I guess, in organization of the organizationalists: vanguard function, which comes back in this book, network system, which becomes ecology. And there's one which doesn't come back, which is what I call the network movement in organization of the organizationalists. And the network movement is basically trying to deal with the problem that what appears as the movement is something else depending on who's looking at it and where they are looking from. And ultimately, this is all part of the ecology. This is all part of the movement, but there is no the network movement would be the ecology as it appears for itself. And the problem is the for itself only exists perspectively. And this is one of the reasons why this doesn't come back in this book, was that I thought it was just gonna make things already too complicated, but also I've been saving a lot of my work on perspectives. This is something I've been working on for the last decade in parallel to this project. And I'm saving all these questions for some other work on the question of perspectivism. But basically, you know, this question is already mapped in there, that obviously the ecology, even if people do think ecologically, they will think different things. They will objectively be thinking different things, even if all of them are thinking ecologically. I don't think that's a problem for the theory. On the other hand, going back to this question of intervening in a specific conjuncture, I feel that maybe we're living in a time where people are being too rigorous in their demarcation. So one of the points of introducing the idea of thinking politics ecologically is telling people maybe not everyone you think is from 0 to 10, where 0 is a friend and 10 is an enemy. Maybe not everyone is a 10. Or maybe of some people you can say they're a 10, but they do some things that are pretty useful for the ecology at this moment. So I think there is an intervention there, in the sense of maybe without denying the importance of demarcation, of tracing boundaries, of saying maybe people are being too stringent with their boundaries. How about we try softer boundaries, or we try broader boundaries, or we use more of the grayscale between 0 and 10, rather than dividing the world, rather than dividing the world in 0s and 10s. How about we use the grayscale a little bit more? Why? Well, because there is a sense in which the ecology itself constrains the possibility of ecological action. If in an ecology where not everyone, in an ecology where very few people are acting, in an ecology where most people are jerks, it's very hard not to be a jerk. So there is a gradient here to follow Gabriel's suggestion at the start, which is, in an ecology where more people are acting ecologically more often, or are acting ecologically to more people, it becomes more possible to act ecologically. So more cooperation becomes possible.
Sorry to interrupt. Don't you think this is it's a kind of vanguard in this sense, or it reminds me of a vanguard, but it reminds me also of a secret society. Sorry, but sometimes, because you know, you have these bad people, jerks, and you have these people that understand the non-competitive, the ecologically acting, and then you have the others. When you talk this way, it sounds to me like you're talking about this kind of leadership that knows something that the others don't know. I don't have a problem with that. That's okay. But I think it's a little bit cryptic when you say that specific quote that I used, and the best we can hope for is that most participants in an ecology embody an ethos of acting ecologically, non-competitively, without a narcissistic investment in their own protagonism, placing the health and the interests of their own or their organizations, and that ecological retain capacity, and so on and so on. You know, when I was really liking everything. I was agreeing with almost everything in the presentation. I didn't read the book, as I said, but the summary was very interesting for me, because yeah, this is great. I know what it's talking about, but this ending, I got so okay. We understand ecologically, but you still need some this preparation, this background from the militants. You know, it's like to this thing to work, you have to have this previous work to create this ideal militant. And I think it's really a problem, because I think it's if you want to have a big movement, sometimes you have to deal with the jerks. My doubt here, listen, my doubt here is, how do you think we have to do with these jerks? You know, we deceive them, we blinded them, and like you manipulate them, or listen, or you just take them out and get this leadership and make this leadership and goes on. I'm not, listen to me, I'm not questioning. I think it's an open question in the book, but because when you say that, it makes me okay. We have this great thing, but we have this problem that's previous to that. Is it clear?
What's the previous problem? I don't get what the previous
to get this ideal militant, this non-competitive. You know,
okay,
this word you use. Yeah.
First of all, the emphasis here is in the best we can hope for.
Yeah.
The best we can hope for is that most. So I'm talking about a gradient, precisely. I'm saying, look, what would make a difference? This would make a difference. If we had more people acting like this could make a difference.
It's a regulative idea.
It's not a regulative. It's not a regulative idea. I don't think it's not a regulative idea, among other things, because, like I said, the ecology itself constrains the capacity for people to act ecologically. So in a situation where you have, in a situation where you have more generous people, there is more generosity. Does this eliminate problems? No. Does this eliminate disagreements? No. Does this eliminate problems? No. Does this eliminate jerks? No. All of those things are part of it, but you can tilt the constraints in favor of, well, wouldn't it be nicer to be in an ecology where there's less jerks? Would you honestly prefer an ecology with more jerks over an ecology with less jerks? Plus, what this actually solves is not the revolution. You know, what this solves is the problem. How can we make the best use of resources? What this solves is the problem. How are we capable of sensing more broadly than our individual selves or than our individual organizations? Well, if there is greater integration among different organizations or among different parts of the ecology, then you're capable of sensing more. You become a more complex. This is another thing it's another thing that I say in the interview with Nick Dyer-Whitford about modeling. Like you become a more complex modeler, and by virtue of that, you become capable of modeling more complex things. So what this does is solve, or not solve, improve a number of questions. Improve, the best that we can hope for is that most improve a situation, and improve the use of resources, the modeling you're capable of, the complexity of the strategies that you're capable of coming up with, etc., etc. Does this guarantee the revolution? No, absolutely not. Why? Because ultimately, everyone who's acting, everyone who's modeling, everyone who's devising strategies, be they individuals or organizations or whatever, they're all finite. They're all working with limited information. They're all working from within their own objective phenomenologies, etc., etc. So it's what the book is saying is actually very modest. You know, what problems do I solve here? Well, maybe if you try to pose questions in the way that the book is posing them, and more people around you, and eventually, you know, this becomes baked into the organizational ethos of different organizations, etc. This becomes part of people's political culture, etc. If more people are doing this, then there's a number of things that tend to get better. You still have all the problems that you had before to contend with, because actually organizing is about those problems, about organizing in relation to those problems.
I know. It's like you're saying that if you have a better understanding of the ecology, maybe you have less jerks. We can say that.
Well, and by having less jerks, you have advantages in your capacity to act. There's cognitive and practical gains to that. But that's, again, the best that we can hope for.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not saying that I've solved any problems for good there. I'm just saying, here are some things that we could improve. But also, here are some things that we could improve in relation to how the ecology as a whole constrains our behaviors. But also in relation to how we pose problems, not only in relation to the ecology as a whole, but in relation to our political practice. Like, you know, stopping self-described horizontal groups from dying before they're even born. You know, not getting your knickers tied up in a twist about, you know, oh, but can we organize? Can we say we're organizing these people, but we're coming from the outside? You know, is this bad? Are we the baddies? You know, avoiding this kind of obstacle to political practice. But the rest of the work all remains to be done. There's one last thing about this, because Caron has had his hand up for a bit. One last thing on this. I was asked in BH when I went there to do a short course on the book. Someone asked me, isn't there an ethics that is implied in this discussion? And I think there is, but you know, I've never thought of it in those terms. And I had to improvise on the spot what the ethics implied in thinking politics ecologically was. And I said, well, the summary of it would be symbiosis and parasitism are also a diet. Like a symbiont is a parasite that's not stupid enough to, you know, risk the life of the one it's in symbiosis with, and the parasite is a symbiotic being who's a jerk. So the ethics would basically be a parasite, but don't be an ass, and be a symbiont, but don't be an ass. It's like, you know, be in symbiosis with others, but not also to the point that others are just taking advantage from you and giving nothing back, and take advantage from others, but not to the point that you're threatening them and the rest of the ecology that you're in.
I think that actually sums up what I was going to ask. For me, there's a kind of a tension for me between, maybe my reading is very different, I don't know, of what you intended, because I tend to differentiate more sharply between the descriptive purport of the model and the prescriptions that might follow from it. So I can envisage, for instance, very easily somebody that uses your model to be more a jerk. Like they can just adopt a certain organizational point of view, ecological point of view, and just conclude that, well, in terms of the balance of forces of the network movement, maybe we're better off if we kill our enemies. Let's do it. So what I'm getting at is that I don't think you can really derive a moral standing from the model. I think maybe an ethics, and the ethics would be just that treating this not as a plan. I'm differentiating between a plan and a vocabulary or a grammar, as Gabriel was saying. Treating this as a vocabulary entails that your understandings go in a certain direction, and this might inform the ways you act, even if you're acting as a jerk. So this does not preclude anybody to act as a jerk, you know. So if you take this as a direct prescription,
nothing does.
Yeah, of course, but yeah. But for instance, there's a difference between a moral philosophy, for instance, and what you're proposing. This is the difference I'm making. Like, I don't think you are, as some, maybe this passage that Michael was commenting upon lends itself to this interpretation, but I don't read the book as saying, do this or do that, as being kind of a, in the first level, at the first level, a prescription, prescriptive kind of program or ethical, moral program of any sort. I see it as a descriptive framework to understand. Maybe it's unfortunate that the network movement was not here, but because I think maybe the final result would be to have a certain comprehension of the network movement as a final balance of as what is the turnout of this in a certain sense. And this might inform tactically and strategically, of course. So in that sense, there is, of course, and might have like an ethical consequence somewhere. But as long as you separate like the descriptive framework and the idea that this is a vocabulary and not a program, really, the prescriptions that might follow, they are a little less heavy in a certain sense. They just are the prescriptions that might follow because you adopt a certain point of view, and that's all. Even if you want to still continue to be an asshole. So this is the way I read it. I don't think this is like, I think in the meeting that Moscardi's presentation, I told something like that, like this is not what's to be done by Lenin. This is not like that. This is kind of a vocabulary, and I don't think that there's any ethics or moral that directly follows from that. It's just a way of evaluating, actually, maybe courses of action.
Yeah, because the ethics has an if-then form. And obviously, I'm not giving any definitive arguments as to why you should subscribe to the same ifs as I do. I'm arguing in the book, I'm saying, well, when I say if this, then that, I'm assuming that if is preferable. But yeah, I'm not saying here's the argument as to why this if is preferable. And I mean, there is the other sense. So you could say this in relation to thinking ecologically as in general terms. But then, even if everyone were thinking ecologically, there would be 1 trillion billion political decisions to be made. So decisions, to put it in very schematic terms, decisions about the relationship between the ecology and the environment, i.e. what it's trying to transform, that I have nothing whatsoever to say about in the book, because I'm not trying to solve them in the book. On the contrary, and this was something else that people in Berga, people pushed me on this, and in some of the events in Europe as well, that I was too agnostic in the book about, like, okay, but what's the strategy? What's the solution? And precisely, I think, as John made a comment here in the chat, having a more modest claim seems to be the other side of taking seriously that global problems require massive participation in order to solve. Precisely, like what I'm saying is, what I'm saying in the book is, well, here are some ways through which I think we can pose these problems better. But I don't have the answer. And even if I did have the answer, that in itself, or, if I did have an answer, I have some answers for for some of them, but I didn't want to, which are my own, but I didn't want people to confuse the grammar with my answers. I wanted there to be a sufficient distance between me and the book that people could use the book for ends that are different than mine, that like for, you know, hopefully not entirely different, but like people with a different, although I'm sure they can too, but people whose analysis would be different from mine, whose idea of a strategy would be different from mine, but they can still use the book. They can still use ideas of the book. And there's lots of moments in the book where I kind of map the reader into the book and say, insert your politics here. You know, there's a bracket which is like your politics here, because I'm not going to, I don't want you to think that this is the correct line for an organizational ecology to have. The line that the organizational ecology will have will be the line that it develops. It has nothing to do with the line that I think it should have. So I wanted to retain this level of contingency between what the book does and, you know, what can follow from the book. I precisely didn't want that to be like too transitive a relation, because I didn't want people to confuse my opinion with the book's opinion. I think the book's opinion is, you know, the book is doing something. The book is bigger than me. It's trying to be. Everyone's got their hand up.
Well, first off, thanks for this presentation, Rodrigo. It's been really great. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I have been in the last presentation and this, and excited to get into it. But I think that this discussion is very much like, yeah, it's really good, because I think it brings up a recurring question since this question of ecology has really been entering, and this kind of like surplus of normativity kind of over the ecological that keeps coming up. And I think, you know, without saying, oh, I don't know, like everyone's got their thinkers. I happen to like Hegel. I don't necessarily have a case for or against. But for me, why I like him and why I could see, like, when it comes to like mapping a conjunctural analysis, Kant would actually make a lot of sense to understand real oppositions. But where Hegel is really useful for me is like trying to map the thinking of stuff on the fly under conditions of what I think we now call trauma, and like what it means to try to like pull together all the facts under limited situations, and with a sense of like importance, like that this is like somehow like ties in the actual existence of myself or my family or my nation or whatever. I think most important thinkers deal with that in their own way. So like, but I do think one of the interesting things that comes up about ecology is it gives a space to think questions of trauma that aren't so kind of individuated, since it's been such a kind of psychologized question for the most part, even within like psychoanalysis, but especially within, I think, like Western kind of psychology therapeutics. It's a very individuated thing. Even though that there are obviously recognitions of trends like intergenerational trauma or collective traumas, like surviving genocides, like things that are very much define a quote people or a collective that aren't in which I think like particularly when it comes to questions of survival, the line between descriptive and normative quickly becomes very blurry and very like actually the political stake, not just the demarcation of who's good or who's bad, but also what exactly is a normative versus a descriptive statement. And that becomes a major point of contention in all the fights over who gets to rule the Soviet Union and apply quote theory to quote practice is, well, is my description of so-and-so an objective description of their like embodiment of like counter-revolutionary tendencies? Or is this like my naming of an enemy in my particular context? And that there are so many times where, you know, on the one hand, it can kind of seem obviously cynical when you're looking at like these party bureaucrats fighting amongst each other. But when you're trying to define the consistency of like the infamous like kulak issue, right? It becomes really difficult to try to like parse out what are these kind of like long-term historical objective conditions which lead a certain sector of society to do this. And like, when does this kind of like relativity that Gabriel brought up, that like these are different components of a larger ecosystem that are trying to figure out how to survive. And that system like was incredibly destabilizing and quite terrifying for the entities known as kulaks, right? And however much it was easy to kind of profile them as an enemy, there were very real complaints and also very real oversimplifications in which all kinds of peoples that should have been considered proletariat or peasant were forced under a category, right? But I think one of the big question marks I've found over the years trying to understand what happened in that particular event as well as others is like this kind of jump from big objective analyses to like explaining individual people by how bad the circumstances were, which often does evoke more of like a trauma psychological. And I'm wondering if like in the context of this work and the kind of grammar you're developing, there's a better way to kind of trace what it means to kind of live under these kind of scars and marks while also trying to kind of get away from, you know, get towards a more descriptive or more grammatical approach so that we don't get caught up in all of these hyper divisive things, which very, you know, are still an issue today. And I think probably everyone here has lived through the nasty infighting and what it does. So like, it's very much a tractable problem. But yeah, I guess like the question of the demarcation of this higher order, like where we draw the line between descriptive and normative, I think the ecological has a lot of openings to discuss it, but I think like it's still very much open problem. So just wondering your thoughts on all that. And thanks again for spending so much time here today.
Thank you. I mean, in relation to the question of trauma, there is a whole chapter on trauma, but I'm thinking trauma or the trauma that I'm discussing is a lot more contained. I mean, that I do talk about fair bit. I do talk a fair bit about trauma because I frame the disappearance of organization and the question of organization and the capacity to discuss organization in a non-dogmatic way as a symptom of trauma. But I don't know if I bring anything new to the question. I mean, those here who've read the book maybe can speak to that. Yeah, I don't know. Gabriel, you have your hand.
Yeah, no, I think that there is something about that connects with another question I was going to make, because I mean I was a bit lost, John. If I didn't get your question right, you can correct me. But I do think that there is an interesting, I mean, it's perhaps even a more strict point there, because in the book trauma appears, which I think it's also a really, really good part of the book, because it's amazing how little this gets commented, that, you know, organizing is, political experimentation is so fucking costly, and it just, you know, it becomes impossible to bear individually the costs of getting involved in things very quickly. And to make yourself part of a certain history in the 20th century and to say you're interested in the same problems is to put yourself in line with a huge catastrophe. So there is a very
well, and then
strict...
on top of that, at some point, we decided that the only correct way to organize was the most time-intensive, labor-intensive way to organize, which was like, how about we get everyone in a square, in a circle, and everyone gets to say something about something. It's one, I think it's yeah.
So I mean, exactly. I mean, it's there. You can almost tell apart the activities that are about organizing in the sense of reducing individual time and increasing complexity, and the other set of activities we do to restrain complexity so we don't get entangled in something we're afraid of. Like, they are the time-consuming ones almost, right? We need to pass along some information, but let's do it in such a way that we can guarantee, let's double the effort to make sure some particular type of organizational phenomena never sets in, which we don't really know the answer to, usually connected to complexity, this kind of scalar aspect of quantities and so on. This connects, ultimately I have the impression that it's not clear exactly to me why this is, your book seems very much centered in many ways in saying, okay, how do we minimally tame or surf, navigate organizational complexity? You want to do things massively, you need to do big things. So how do you navigate bigness, right? Kind of complexity in that sense. So there is I think, even more profound connection between trauma and this, which is not simply how trauma blocked the question of organizational complexity, but there is also the other side, which this is something that really surprised me a long time ago when I learned about this, which is, for example, in Brazil, a lot of people who went through the dictatorship and were tortured and so on did analysis. And when they were called by the Truth Commission to talk about their experiences, it was as if nothing had happened in terms of analysis. They were just, a lot of people were absolutely, traumas were untouched by this private thing. But people who went into like testimony clinics that are kind of organized in such a way that what they say there is connected with a slightly larger network that is itself connected with making claims or making statements towards the state, demanding recognition, so that their participation is embedded in this larger process. Somehow, in that context, some things get worked through that in the private context, it doesn't. So the principle that you need massive action to change massive things, you can also be more nuanced with it, in the idea that it takes objects of a certain complexity to touch on certain complex phenomena. So to look at things ecologically, in the sense to see yourself as part of a more complex object, also implies that the anxiety of organizing can be distributed in a larger network than simply, you go to sleep at night thinking, okay, I need to be able to account for every step of cause and consequence of what these guys I'm involved with are doing. So I think that there is also subjective aspect of thinking ecologically, or thinking in a way that is more attuned to these larger networks of influence and concatenation between organizations, that directly deals with, in the amount of patients I have who are militants and simply cannot bear, you put yourself in a position where all responsibility needs to be explained away in these really small chunks, because you have these small groups, small parties and so on, but effects need to be much larger. So it's totally kind of imbalanced. So I think that there is, to the point of trauma, there is actually something I'd be curious to see. I think it's almost like an interesting prediction that the more complex the organizations we understand to be part of, the more bearable, more tractable complex problems become, and the less, let's say, the mismeasure between the causes and the effects might become.
The more we understand ourselves not to act freely, the more or the more we understand that what happens to us is not freely decided by anyone, the more bearable. You're coming to a very Spinozist conclusion.
I was always there. I have no problem with this. I don't know why Michael thinks so. I have a problem with Michael, not with Spinoza.
We all do.
Yeah, but my question. Sorry, yeah.
No, I was going to say, I think that's a great summary of what I was trying to do, was precisely, not, because I think the problem, we were talking about Jody Dean earlier, and I think part of the problem of with what Jody Dean is trying to do is that, I think she's posing lots of excellent questions, and I get a lot from her work. But then when it comes to prescription, it's almost as if, we should have a party. That sadly not a party as in party. We should have a political party, and then there's no recognition of the fact that, well, we kind of tried that in the past and it didn't go so well. It is as if, like, there's a sense in which she's completely, she appears to be completely ignoring the trauma and saying the trauma is not legitimate. Why are you talking about trauma? This is what we need to do. Whereas what I'm trying to address is, this trauma exists, it's legitimate, and even if it weren't, people have it anyway, so it would be there either way. How can we acknowledge the legitimacy of it without this meaning us giving up on our desire to change things, and then tricking ourselves that we're still working to change things, but we're working to change things. We've put all these constraints on how we're going to try and change things, that we're only going to act in very small groups. We're going to have these super time-consuming processes, etc., etc. Jesus.
Yeah, the night is just beginning here in Santa Teresa.
So yeah, just to say that would actually be a good summary.
So this is a good segue to the question that I wanted to ask, because I think it goes into a bit of more of the technical way that the leadership function, organizational cores, vanguard functions, those concepts are constructed. And one of the things I was talking to Dennis this week, and we were trying to think, okay, how do we pose the questions of what these things are doing in terms of the framework we've been working on? And I think that the mediating term to facilitate that transition is the following. For example, in this example I just gave of people who do clinical work with the testimony clinic, they are not direct, like phenomenologically, they're not aware of this necessarily, of the complexity of this network, but the clinician in that context acts by being constrained by all these forces. So you will listen to some things, you will not let some things pass on in silence because you're politically engaged. So those things need to be demarcated rather than others. So you're acting with an element. So you're only engaging with a person, but they are constrained by such a complex network that the form of that complexity is now, let's say, you're raised to that level. So even though you're not aware, there's something that stands in for something which is slightly bigger, right? I think that the cheapest theory of this we have of something small that stands in for this totality is, like, for example, Laclau talking about floating signifier as a universal equivalent. For all the sort of we know the discursive, like the problem of emphasizing the discursive aspect of all of this, the linguistic, blah, blah, blah. What I feel there's also the intuition there. And I feel like when you're constructing the concept of organizing core, the vanguard function, this aspect of it is implied, but not necessarily the focus, which is that the more these things get stable, they are, let's say, an organizing core that is enduring, and that more often than not plays some role of introducing some new behavior into this ecology. It becomes a small part that if I measure myself with relation to it, I'm already acting more ecologically than if I were to simply act directly from my standpoint as a militant somehow. This seems implied in the book all the way until the platform concept, because then I think that there is a shift that happens there. I framed it in this way. I'm not sure if you thought it was a good idea. I framed it in this way also because I know you're working with the idea of the concept of transition. And this is how we've been thinking about transition because of a recent development in this categorical cybernetics. There's this guy in this new cybercat theory that they focus on this, on the threshold at which a system and an environment change places. So rather than describing a system acting on an environment, it becomes more intelligible if you treat the system as the thing constraining the environment and the environment that is acting on the system. And that seems to be a really good idea of what a transition looks like, because there is some perspective shift. You're still acting, there's still work to be done, but now it becomes more intelligible to treat that system of actions as a cost measure for other people's actions, rather than to treat it as the thing that's trying to advance in space, right? Almost like a shift in the foreground and the background. So the platform seems very much the moment in the book that you experiment with that idea, because suddenly the organizational cores that actually, let's say, are connected with particular militants, putting some protocols or ideas in place, the actors disappear and the actions gain some autonomy. And it's no longer a matter of if you're part or not of an organization. It becomes a matter of, well, if you act in this way under a certain range of deviations, we understand we're all part of the same thing. So it becomes more like an environment for politics than a set of actions that are being clearly thought in terms of a strategy, right? So I just wanted to see first if this makes sense, this way of thinking that between leadership functions where it has that minimal flavor of looking at a point that gives you a better view of what you're doing than straight looking from your own perspective, like this like a weak form of sovereignty or something like this, right? In just the sense of it's better to look from its standpoint than your own standpoint. Then you get a feeling that duration starts to imbue some parts of this ecology with that function, right? It's no longer if you introduce new behavior, but well, if that introduction in that place seems to maintain itself, those people doing that, they manage to continue to exist, well, that says something. So looking at that duration now plays a similar role. It becomes I'm trying to redescribe these steps, not so much in terms of capacity to act, but in terms of being better measures for what's going on in the ecology than your own standpoint, which is our previous conversation, right? So first I wanted to understand if you think that this inversion makes sense, right? Looking almost in terms of the capacity to map an ecology, but locally, right? Rather than talking in terms of are militants thinking ecologically? You can think, are these organizational cores the ones more vanguard function or the ones less in that position? But are they good kind of reductions of what the ecology, of the direction of the ecology, right? And so if this makes sense, yes, you were about.
I mean, you still to frame it in those terms, you would still have to have the idea that, I mean, it's just a minor quibble, but it's something that seemed to come up in the discussion that you had in the book the other time, but like someone was making this really sharp opposition between, it's either the individual or it's something above the individual. well, to think of the vanguard function in those terms, you would already need to, as an individual, have, if it's an individual thinking that about the vanguard function, the individual would need to have the idea of ecology as well. And I basically don't think there is the sharp opposition that someone was trying to establish, where like it's either, maybe it was even you.
Yeah, it might
either
be. Yeah, I don't.
who think ecologically, or it's something else. It's like, well, if organizations think ecologically, they're either that or if organizations are capable of constraining the behavior of individuals in a more ecological way, that's either by chance or by design. If it's by chance, that there's nothing we can do about that. If it is by design, then it was probably designed by individuals to do that. So, you know, I don't see why talking about individuals would preempt talking about organizations.
Yeah,
anyway,
no.
This is,
yeah, I don't think that's. Yeah, you can leave that aside. I don't think that's the crucial part. Like,
yeah, this is not the point here. I hadn't thought of, because yeah, I mean, this totally amounts to translating what I'm doing in the book into the language that you're using in the group. And because I'm not so familiar with the language of the group yet, it's not entirely clear to me what all the work that measuring is doing, what is all the work that measuring is doing here. But I think it could work if we're talking about a vanguard function that becomes fixed over time. Like if we include the element of duration, that you can, like basically if someone appears to be getting things right with some regularity, then you're going to suspect that these people know things that you don't. Basically, it's like, well, clearly there are things that they're seeing that I'm not seeing, and this is why they get it right. But then the thing about the platform is, like, one of the things that they would be getting right would be creating the capacity to create platforms. And there is a whole issue about what happens to the organizing cause once the platform is created. So again, there is this gradient of, you know, people who just let the platform go and disappear entirely in the background. And then people who, let's say, you know, three gradations of that. On the one hand, you have like whoever it was. Well, actually, we know we know who it was in São Paulo, at least. Passe Livre in relation to 2013. So you set up the platform, and then eventually you literally leave. And their strategy was always like, we set up the platform, and then it was called Tática da Baderna, you know, and then there'll be a popular revolt, and the point is the popular revolt. So we set up a platform for popular revolt, and then we don't leave physically, but like who we are is irrelevant. On the other extreme, you have something like Extinction Rebellion, where the sell to people is very much be a part of our group. We're not inviting you to think strategy. We're not inviting you to, to decide what the group does. We're inviting you to put your body in the line when we organize actions. And we basically tell you when an action is, and you go. And some people are up for that. Lots of people are up for that. It's actually a very, if we were talking about horizontalism being incredibly labor and time intensive, this is the exact opposite. This is like, you want, this is like rent a demo for people who actually would love to be in demos, but they don't have the time to prepare demos and to be in organizations that organize demos and deal with the fallout of demos afterwards. So they put their name down and it's like, yeah, great. I'd love to take action against climate change. Send me a text message, I'll be there. And I don't want to be involved in the strategy. I don't want to be involved in any of the bigger questions. And then in the middle, you'd have something like UK Uncut in the UK, or even Momentum, where like you set up, some people set up a platform, the platform is successful, and then eventually these people are like, okay, now we need to control this somewhat, because we need to make sure that it's functioning within the ranges that we established. So I'm not sure that there, the inversion would, I mean, it doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah, I think, for example, for example, to give you the sort of thing I'm thinking of, one thing is to you asked like, okay, what is Measure doing all of this? Of course, I'm not trying to make this into like this is how we think about these things. I think we could talk about that some other time. But the reason why I think this is relevant is, for example, I think that there are three, perhaps two kind of good examples of things we tend to focus on when you want to see something bigger than yourself. You can look at people who represent more people. It can be one person or many people. It can be protocols, right? Through protocols, we can coordinate large actions. Or you can look at objects, fluctuations like the price of rice. A lot of political action now in Brazil is based on, let's say, everyone look at the price of rice, and kind of that's what we want to see changed. That's what we're directing people's attention to. We can direct it, for example, to if a particular candidate in a particular electoral game will get a bigger or smaller vote. That's a different thing we can focus attention to. Those things kind of correspond to, let's say, three ways of compose. We can either compose people together, and so one person represents a larger group. You can look at these established protocols, and they should mediate these connections between people who cannot directly interact. Or you can look at prices of things you need to consume, or something like that, or wages, or 20 cents in the bus fare, right? It seems that from our perspective, since the way we've been approaching this is to look at organizational problems, political organizational problems, and say, how do they look? How does the organizational sphere or the field of political organization look when compared with these well-established social forms of measuring understood almost in the sense of representing, right? You represent a larger chunk of a movement by a leader. You represent a larger chunk of a state through protocols or laws. You represent a larger chunk of the economy by the fluctuation of a commodity. And we're trying to expand this and think organization under the same logic and say, ultimately, if you're interested in a large social transition, you're concerned with producing new social parameters that will remain once a certain level of labor-intensive organizing has gone away. That's why this shift between action and constraint seems relevant, because ultimately then this becomes some level of social constraints that are not necessarily identified with particular actors anymore. So I think that's a bit of the underlying strategy, conceptual strategy for our sake, which is clearly different from, I mean, you're not interested in comparing the building of a movement with the building of an economy, for example, right? I'm even interested also in the relation between the two, because that's perhaps how I would introduce as a sub-region of an ecology, the concept of an economy. An economy is how you represent an ecology of, for example, producers to themselves without them having to think about it ecologically. They think about wages, the price of rice, the price of some supplies, and they are thinking ecologically, but I mean, it's a classical problem of social coordination, right? So we've been trying to think organization in a continuum with the problem of social coordination. That's why I'm pushing a bit that question when we look at these concepts of leadership function and organizing. That's kind of the underlying stakes, right? So that we guarantee that once we formulate the concepts, we already guaranteed conceptually that they will be continuous with that problem. So we don't mistake a conceptual problem because we just formulated them too differently. Like Marxists think about political economy with conceptual frame, and then think about organizing with totally different conceptual frame. And then of course these things don't match, right? So that's, I would say, is the conceptual strategy behind. So to see if we're able to, let's say, supplement what you've been doing with these other questions, I think it's just a matter of, can we also track together with this dynamic development of increasing complexity and which remains multipolar and all of that, if we can also track this property of complex organizations, which is either by design or not. I think here the agnosticism and the ambivalence between description and prescription is still valid, and we shouldn't, I think it's the same line really, but keeping to that, can we also kind of have a vocabulary to track under which conditions, let's say, a platform is also becoming a way that I can look at it and see something, the coordination of something larger. I think in the case of platforms, this is more or less clear. For example, the two extremes we were talking about, right? I mean, you could also say like the MPL strategy, in a way, is saying, well, revolts are guided by the price of the bus fares. They're not guided by our direction. That's the evaluation of, is it enough or not? Whereas Extinction Rebellion is saying, well, the small Politburo, that's the measure of how to act. So they stick with a more kind of, leader-based measure, and the others stay with a more commodity-based measure somehow. But that's kind of the underlying reason of this question, if this kind of mapping parameter is something you think we can add to this construction,
Yeah, no, I think it could work in relation to the Vanguard function. I'm not sure. I mean, I think maybe the answer would be maybe in relation to platforms, that it would only apply to platforms of a certain degree of complexity. I don't know. I would have to think more about it. But this thing on what is it? Cybernetic category theory. Yeah, no, this sounds very much up my street. I'll have to look that up.
One of the guys who's of the guys who's working on this, he's presenting to us his work. I'll send you his stuff. He has a really good blog where he just is very kind of gives a really good introduction of what they're up to. And he's actually coming to the group like in October to present his stuff. He's a really cool, really nice Italian guy. I already suggested your book to him. I'm sure he would love to chat.
Awesome. That would be great. I'll come back then.
Guys, it's 9 in the evening. I'm not sure if anyone has more. I imagine Rodrigo might be a bit tired after this.
I woke up at 7 today, so I'm flagging. And I think we've been going for 3 hours. That's pretty
Yeah, that's actually our standard. That's
All right.
Yeah, so we're pretty much on the. I'm not sure if anyone has like one last comment or something. The classic. I don't have a question. I just have kind of a comment, and then. Yeah, Michael is
Yeah,
already.
I don't have much. I mean, this is a really good conversation. I just want to say thank you for lending your time and writing this book. It's a really great project, and I'm sure we'll be returning to it again and again. Like it's kind of become a reference point for us in organizing all of our debates.
That's awesome to hear, and thank you a lot for your questions. And I'm sadly, I wish I could come back every Monday. Sadly, I can't guarantee that, but I'll keep an eye on the program so I can come for like these discussions on. I mean, the next session sounds super interesting as well, but I don't think I can come to all of them.
I'll send you the book that Dennis is presenting on. It's really, really amazing stuff.
Yeah, you should really check out that book. I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Great. Yeah. No, I'll have a look for sure. And maybe I'll catch up on the sessions on YouTube later.
Great. Michael's already watching TV rather than paying attention, so that's a good. Yeah, that's how we know it's time to wrap up. Anyway, Rodrigo, thank you so much, man.
Thank you, and well, till
we'll
next
talk.
time.
See ya.
Take care.
Take care.
See you, Dennis.
Ciao, ciao.